Chapter 15. Wolfwind slipped through the narrow opening in the breakwater that protected Al-Shabaab harbor. She was under oars, and the sail had been gathered and furled to the yardam. At the peak of the mast flew Evelyn's pennant, 4 meters long, undulating slowly in the offshore breeze to display a red hawk on a white field. Even if the red hawk device itself was not recognized, the extreme length of the pennant and its shape, broad where the hawk device was shown, then narrowing rapidly until it split into 2 swallow-tails a meter from its end, were enough to indicate that the ship was carrying a royal delegation, an ambassador at least, or perhaps even a member of the royal family. Svengal had ordered the pennant unfurled when they were still a kilometer offshore, making it clear that the ship had no warlike intent, in spite of the fact that the crew of dozens or so merchant ships that were anchored at the harbor or tied up to the docks had armed themselves and stood ready along their bulwarks to repel any attack by the Scandians. Sailors in this part of the world, and most of the others, for that matter, knew the Scandians' reputation all too well. The presence of a royal standard did little to allay their suspicions. Wolfwind, lean, narrow, and deadly-looking, slipped past the first of the anchored ships, for all of the world looking like a wolf slinking among a flock of fat, nervous sheep. "Looks like we have a reception committee," Halt said, indicating the main wharf that ran along the inland side of the harbor. There, they could see a body of men drawn up, perhaps 50 in all, and from time to time the sun glinted off burnished armor or weapons. A green banner was waving from the pier, the international sign that they were cleared to come alongside. Svengal leaned on the tiller, and the bow swung toward the inner harbor. The bow oarsman called the stroke, and the wolf ship moved smoothly up the harbor. "I'd better get my reception clothes on," Evelyn said. She slipped below, into the small triangular chamber at the stern of the ship. There was barely headroom for her to stand erect there, but at least she had a little privacy. A few minutes later, she reemerged. She had replaced her usual leather tunic with a longer one of dull red satin, which came almost to her knees. It was beautifully embroidered and carried a small red hawk device on her left breast. A broad leather belt gathered the red tunic at the waist. Will noticed idly that the belt was decorated with what seemed to be interwoven leather thongs, threaded in and out through slits in the belt itself, and crisscrossing for the entire length. The long boots and hose remained, as did the white silk shirt she had worn under the tunic. On her blonde hair, hastily brushed and gathered, she wore a red, narrow-brimmed hat with a long bill. A single hawk's feather was set in the headband. She wore a necklace Will had never seen before. It was made of dull gray stones, all the same size. They didn't look too expensive or even semi-precious. More like smooth marble, in fact. Maybe she wore it for luck. Evelyn tugged the tunic straight, removing the last few wrinkles where the belt had cinched it too tightly. She cleared her throat nervously. "How do I look?" she asked Halt. Halt nodded approval. "Just the right blend of practicality and formality," he replied. She flashed a quick grin at him. She was nervous, Halt saw. "Svengal and I will do the talking for the time being. This will be just minor officials, the harbor master or so forth," he said. "Your turn will come when we meet the Wakir. For the time being, look arrogant and condescending." She started to smile, realized that such an expression didn't fit to his instructions, and instead arched her eyebrows and raised her chin, tilting her head back imperiously, so she could stare down her nose at him. "How's that?" she asked. She thought she saw the faintest trace of a grin in the shadows under his cowl. "That's perfect. You could have been born into it." "Don't make me smile or I'll have you flogged," she said quietly. Halt nodded. "You could be catching on too fast," he said. Then his attention was drawn to the business of docking the ship. Svengal was a flamboyant ship handler, and he brought her in fast. At the last moment, he growled an order for the oarsmen, and they backwatered fiercely, taking most of the way off her. "Oars!" he yelled. Then the dripping blades rose out of the water, coming vertical, before the oarsmen laid them down in their brackets. Then there was the usual clatter of oak on oak. The ship ghosted for a few meters. Then there was an angle of about 30 degrees to the dock, and one of the crew threw a line from the bow. An Erak dockworker quickly grabbed it, wound it around the bollard, and began to haul in. A few seconds later, another rope soared over the water from the stern. This too was seized, and the men on shore began to haul the wolf ship alongside. The crew threw felt and wicker fenders over the side to protect the ship's scandlings from the hard stone of the warp. As the ropes were made tight, fore and aft, Wolfwind knocked gently against the jetty, the fenders groaning and creaking slightly as she did so. The railing of the ship was a meter or so below the level of the wharf. Evelyn started toward it, but Halt's low voice stopped her. "Stay where you are. Look imperious. We have to be invited ashore first." The armed men they had seen from further out were arranged along the wharf now, in two ranks, facing the wolf ship. They all had shields slung ready for action, and their hands hovered close by the hilts of their swords. An officer detached himself from the line and strode forward toward the wharf's edge. Svengal recognized him. "This is the bantam rooster who ambushed us in the town square," he said, in what he thought was a whisper. Halt glanced at Svengal sardonically. "I'm sure he'd thrilled to be here you said so," he replied. The tall Erak warrior stopped now, a few paces back from the edge of the wharf. Halt studied him keenly, and came to the rapid conclusion that this man was a man to be reckoned with. There was an air of assurance about him. Halt sensed that he was not a man to bluster or bluff. He knew what he was doing, and he would bear watching, the ranger thought. The Erak gave the traditional desert greeting, touching his right hand to his lips, then his forehead, then his lips again. The gesture was born from the old tribal saying of first meetings. Halt knew. We will eat, we will consider, we will talk. The correct protocol was to return the gesture, but Svengal didn't know that. He waved his hand vaguely in the air in a clumsy parody of the man's graceful movements. "You're back, Northmen." The tones were deep, cultured. The voice was calm and unruffled. Its owner had learned the skill of projecting one's words without seeming to shout them. "I've come for the Oberjarl," Svengal said. He wasn't one for the necessities of protocol or beating around the bush. The Erak smiled. "Svengal, isn't it?" Svengal nodded. "Aye, it is. But you've got the advantage of me." He felt uncomfortable standing below the other man, forced to look up at him. He wondered where the Erak had learned his name, and decided that Erak must have mentioned it to him. In their previous encounter, there had been no introductions. Svengal and the crew had been held prisoner separate from Erak until the day they were released, when the Oberjarl gave Svengal his instructions about the ransom. "I am called Selaethen by my people," the Erak told him. "Foreigners usually find it more convenient to shorten the name to Selaethen. I am the captain of the Erak Guard." "Well, enchanted," Svengal replied brusquely. He recalled the word from some dim memory of a lesson in politeness that he had been given when he was younger. He assumed it was appropriate. Selaethen's face remained expressionless, but Will was sure he could see a trace of a smile in the dark eyes. "We didn't expect you back so soon," Selaethen said. Then he gestured at the long pennant that still floated lazily in the light breeze. "Nor did we expect you in such company. Surely you haven't had time to return to your home country. Whose flag is that flying at your masthead?" Halt thought it was time somebody gave Svengal some help. The Scandian was a master at navigation and seamanship, but his negotiation skills were limited to brandishing an axe and bellowing, "Hand over everything you've got!" A smoother approach was called for here. "Captain Svengal is a friend of the royal family of Eraluin," he said, stepping forward. As he spoke, he slipped the cowl back so that his face and features were no longer in shadow. "The pennant is an Eraluin royal standard, belonging to my lady here." He indicated Evelyn, who was doing her best to look disinterested and condescending at the same time. The Iridi glanced at her, and she felt his keen eyes on her. She thought a contemptuous toss of her head might be in the keeping. She tossed it contemptuously. Saladin switched back his gaze to Halt. "And your lady is?" he queried. "My lady is prepared to negotiate the terms of the Oberdrau's release with your leader," Halt told him smoothly. "Erak, too, is a close friend of the royal family of Araluan." He felt that it was best to keep the captain guessing as to Evelyn's real identity and position. Uncertainty such as that could work for them. There was no real need to reveal her title to an underling. Saladin considered this for a few seconds. Obviously, it was an unexpected turn in the proceedings. His face, however, showed no sign of rapid thinking or evaluation that was going on behind his calm, unflustered look. Eventually, he spoke again. "Unfortunately, the Wakir is not available today," he said. He faced Svengal again. "As I said, we did not expect you to return so soon, unless—" He tailed off, the thought lost. "Unless what?" Svengal wanted to know. The Iridi inclined his head apology. "Unless you had gathered some of your countrymen and came back here to release him by force," he said. Svengal grunted. "The thought did occur to me." This time, they all saw a smile on Saladin's face. "I'm sure it did. However, the fact remains that it is impossible to arrange a meeting with the Wakir at such short notice. We could not contemplate such a thing before tomorrow." Halt nodded agreement. "Tomorrow will be fine," he said. "Could we perhaps see Oberdrau Erak in the meantime?" Saladin already was shaking his head before he finished the request. "Unfortunately, it is not possible either, but I can offer her ladyship comfortable quarters until tomorrow. We have a guest house that will certainly be more comfortable than a Scandian raiding ship." He indicated a substantial two-story building set back a little from the waterfront. Unlike the solid, featureless warehouse along the quay, it had shaded balconies and wide doorways and windows on the upper floor. "There is room up there for your ladyship and her immediate party," he said. "The ship's crew will remain on board, I regret to say." Even his tone told him that he did not regret it too deeply. Halt shrugged. No town would want 30 fully armed Scandians coming ashore. He was certain that the bulk of the Iridi soldiers currently on the wharf would remain there to keep an eye on things. "Fine by me," Svengal said gruffly. There was no way he would be willing to leave the ship empty and undefended while he was in potentially hostile port. He'd rather they keep an eye on Wolfwind. Any Scandian ashore was mindful that his ship was his only line of retreat. "Then, if you would follow me," the Iridi captain gestured in the direction of the guest house and began to turn away. Evelyn's crisp voice stopped him. "Captain Saladin, aren't you forgetting something?" He turned back, impressed by her tone of command and by the fact that she had mastered the full form of his name perfectly, after having heard it only once. He bowed deeply. "My lady?" he asked, and she strode forward to the rail of the ship, holding out her right fist to display a large signet ring on the second finger. "Surely you'll need to convey my seal to your Wakir before he can consent to our meeting." Again, her pronunciation was perfect, as she managed to add a slight guttural sound to the initial letter of Wakir. Saladin nodded apologetically and produced a small wax impression box. It was about the size of a box that would contain a ring. It was made from gleaming ebony and had a snap-hinged lid. "But of course, my lady," he said. He passed the little box to Halt, who hinged it back and handed it to Evelyn. Inside was a layer of firm wax. She pressed her ring into it now, leaving a clear impression of her hawk device. Then she snapped the lid shut and to protect it from damage and handed it back to Halt. The ranger passed it back to Saladin, who tucked it into a pouch in his belt. "Now, perhaps I could show you to your accommodation," he said. Holt and Gillen stepped up onto the wharf, and Celadon drew back to allow them access. They turned and held their hands down to Evelyn, and she stepped up lightly after them. Will and Horace followed. Svengal, after a few words to Axel, mainly along the lines of, "Nobody is to come aboard," brought up the rear. Celadon eyed the three figures in the gray and green cowled cloaks, taking in the massive longbows that each of them slung over their shoulders. Strange, he thought. I must find more about these. He gave a quiet order, and the file of 10 soldiers detached themselves from the wharf contingent and led the way toward the guest house. As Horace passed Celadon, the two warriors eyed each other, and like recognized like. Celadon saw the broad shoulders, the tapered hips, and the easy balanced stride. A long straight sword hung at the Araluan's belt. This one, I understand, Celadon thought. He would make a dangerous enemy. At the same time, Horace was taking in the slim build, the athletic movement, and the long curved sword that hung at Celadon's waist. This one would be a bit of a handful, he thought. They were both right.